Feet are weird. Feet, have you ever thought about feet very much? Feet, they're kind of like hands that you walk on, except you don't touch other people's feet. You shake hands with other people, but you don't touch other people's feet. Touching other people's hands is fine, but touching other people's feet is kind of gross. Okay. A lot of people not only don't want to touch somebody else's feet, but they also don't want anybody touching their feet. Unless you're a woman. Because then pedicures, those totally fine. Okay? The rules are absurd if you give them any real thought about this. Why is it that we don't like the idea of touching feet? Is it because feet stink? Not all feet stink. Sometimes shoes stink, but as long as you bathe regularly, your feet shouldn't be all that bad. Is it because feet are dirty or ugly? Well, if feet are so dirty and ugly, women, why are you painting your toenails? Maybe it's all a holdover from some prior time in our history as human beings. Maybe it's a holdover from a time before we had good closed-toed shoes, before we had paved sidewalks and carpeted buildings. Maybe it's a holdover from a time when feet really were dirty because you walked everywhere on dirt roads, trying not to step in donkey manure. When you think about it in those terms, when you try to imagine what feet must have been like in Jesus' time, they had to have been pretty dirty. Back in His time, they didn't even really have sewers for human waste, much less animal waste, unless you count the little sort of ditch in the road. Your feet would get pretty dirty just from going place to place in the course of an ordinary day. And so it was the custom in Jesus' time that when you got to where you were going, say to a dinner party or a Passover meal like the disciples were in this passage, it was customary for the host to provide a towel and a basin with some water for you to just wash your feet before supper. You got to remember, tables back then were not up like ours are. You didn't have chairs. Everyone sat on a floor, maybe on a cushion, and so you sort of reclined back against one another. So your feet were up in somebody else's business. Dirty feet might ruin the appetite. Now, in cases where the host was a person of means, or maybe if this was a particularly special occasion, the host might have servants there who would come and wash your feet as you entered in. Now, how fancy is that? But apparently that wasn't the case in this particular dinner party in John 13. Yet even so, rather than just letting everybody wash their own feet, it tells us that Jesus Himself took on the double role of both host and servant to wash His disciples' feet. That was, and it's hard for us to understand just how much it was, but that was a radical, uncommon expression of love for Jesus to get down on His hands and knees that night. But it was perfectly in keeping with Jesus' character and mission. May have been the first time that anybody had ever done something like that when they were in a position of authority, power, of leadership, the way that Jesus was to do that. But it certainly was not something out of Jesus' character. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, He was modeling servant leadership for them. I want us to just refresh the basic story of what's going on here in our minds. Let's read those verses again. John chapter 13, 1 through 12. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for Him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. And the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under His power, and that He had come from God and was returning to God. So He got up from the meal, took off His outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around His waist. And after that He poured water into a basin and began to wash His disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around Him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to Him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Well then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not all of you." For He knew who was going to betray Him, and that was why He said not everyone was clean. When He had finished washing their feet, He put on His clothes and returned to His place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" He asked them. So the setting for this scene is the same as for the high priestly prayer that we've studied the last 3 weeks. This is still the Last Supper. This is actually before the prayer. And it's on the night when Jesus is going to leave from here, go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and be arrested. This is the night when He's going to begin being put on trial, the evening before the morning when He's going to be handed over to Pilate in order to be crucified by the Romans. And that's why it says Jesus knew that the hour had come for Him to leave this world and go to the Father. But on a night like that, Jesus wasn't thinking about Himself. He was focused on His friends, on His disciples that He was going to leave behind. John writes here, he says, "Having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end." That's not just referring to the chronological end, to the end of His life, but that's to the end as in to the uttermost, to the max. Jesus loved them. The story that John tells in these verses is an expression of Jesus' great love for His disciples. And that being the case, it's important for us to note the other two people who are specifically named in this passage. Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, and Simon Peter, the denier. Peter's role is pretty clear in these verses. He's kind of the representative of the disciples, at least in this passage. But have you ever thought about what it must have been like for Jesus, as He was washing His disciples' feet, for Him also to wash the feet of Judas Iscariot? Can you imagine the tension that Judas must have felt as he allowed Jesus to tenderly handle his feet, to express love for him in such an intimate, personal way? Can you imagine the sorrow of Jesus in this moment? He knows that this man who He cares so deeply for is going to betray Him in just a matter of hours. Could you have done what Jesus did? Could you have washed your betrayer's feet? Verse 3 makes it perfectly clear that Jesus is in control. It says, God has put all things under His power. Jesus is, quite literally, at this point in the gospel, considered the king of everything. But in verse 4 it says, He took off His outer clothing, kind of like how He took off heavenly glory to come down into the world as a human being. It says He wrapped a towel around His waist, putting on the uniform of a servant. It says he filled the basin and began washing 24 dusty, dirty, road-blistered, leathery, mule manure-stained man feet. And when he got around to Peter, it was just a little bit too much for him to take. For Peter to take. He didn't know what to say. Peter never knows what to say, but that doesn't stop him. And so he asks a dumb question. He says, "Are you going to wash my feet?" Well, what do you think is going on here, Peter? You really are dumb as a rock. Oh, wait, that's what I would have said. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said to him, "Look, you don't realize what I'm doing right now, but later you'll be able to look back on this and you'll understand. Just trust me." Jesus, much better response. But Peter doesn't want to wait to understand. He just says, "No, you will not wash my feet." And that's the point at which something really interesting starts to happen in this story. Because Jesus responds, he says, "Unless I wash you, you have no part in me." Unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Do you maybe get the sense here that Jesus is talking about more than feet now? Or do you think that Jesus just takes his pedal hygiene that seriously? Feet are a big deal to Jesus. I think what's taking place in this story, in this passage, is it's a microcosm of the whole ministry of Jesus. It's the whole gospel story in miniature. It begins with Jesus, the King, all powerful. Everything is under his authority. And then he takes off his outer garment, setting aside that heavenly glory, getting down on the floor among the dirt and the grime and the sin of humanity. And he puts on a towel, taking the form of a servant. And he serves the world, washing away all of that grime and sin with his own hands. Those same hands which this time tomorrow will bear the marks of the cross. And having done the job, in verse 12, it says, he put on his clothes and returned to his place, to that heavenly glory at the right hand of the Father. That right there, that is what the love of God is like. Forsaking everything, setting it aside for our sake. And make no mistake, okay? God, He doesn't need us in the midst of all of our sin and mess and everything. Down here in our disobedience, God doesn't need us. The truth is this: humanity was trouble from the start. Okay, we start the story in Genesis by trying to pull one over on God eating the fruit in the garden, and it is so bad that just 5 chapters into Genesis, things have become so bad that God destroys the whole world to start over. And then just 2 chapters after that story is over, God invents somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,500 languages to keep us confused and divided so that we'll stop trying to rise up against Him. God has no obligation to humanity. He doesn't serve us. He made us to represent Him in the world as image bearers. Our job is to be His representative in the world. He doesn't need us, but He gave us that. He could have just done away with us completely. And if God had chosen just to say, you know what, this whole creation idea, not working out. We're going to mothball this project. We're putting it away. Then He would have been completely 100% justified in doing that. But that is not what happened. That's not the story that the Bible tells. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. For God so loved the world that He got down here in the dirt with us. But you know what else is crazy about this story? Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It's not talking about baptism. That's not a metaphor for baptism. In fact, this is not about salvation at all. The disciples had already, he says, they already had a bath. They were already clean. Jesus has pronounced them clean earlier in John's Gospel. Washing the feet, that's about the everyday, ordinary cleanliness. Washing your feet in the ancient world is like washing your hands today. We wash our hands all day long. For Jesus to do that ordinary, everyday thing for the disciples, that's the mark of relationship. That is a sign of love in a really profound way. It's kind of like when Jessica uses a tissue to wipe the boogers out of Robert's nose 20 times a day. You should see how fast we go through boxes of Kleenex. It's kind of like when we wash his face after he eats. When we clean out the toe jam that he somehow managed to get on his feet while he was sleeping in the morning before we get him dressed. Those things are not strictly necessary for Robert's survival. Okay? He would survive if he went around with a dirty face and a snotty nose. He would live. He would hopefully grow up maybe even to be a productive member of society. Who knows? He might not know how to wipe his nose, but he would make it. The reason we do those things, fundamentally, they're an expression of love, an expression of relationship. Believe me, I'm not wiping anybody else's nose. There's a relationship there that gives me the impulse to do something for him that whether he was able to do it for himself or not, I would still do it. That's the way that God loves. With the intimacy of a mother's warm, wet washcloth, wiping the sleep out of our eyes every morning before we take on the day. That's love. That's love not just for us to keep, but love for us to share. John 13. Let's pick it back up in verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Is it really any surprise that Jesus tells his disciples to follow the example of radical humility and loving care for others that he set for them? It's kind of Jesus 101, to love others, to follow his example, to be that way toward other people. But here's the part that we often miss about that. When we say to love others, when we say to do as Jesus did, when we say follow Jesus' example as we live in the world, to be his kingdom people, this is what people misunderstand. This is not a religious requirement. Okay? This is not a new rule that we get to tack on to the bottom of the Ten Commandments. Jesus isn't issuing a generic call to serve others. He's not just saying, go serve people. That's what you're supposed to do. Go do that. This is a call for us to serve others the way that Jesus served them. To love other people like Jesus loved his disciples. There's a fundamental difference in that. Here's where the rubber meets the road. You can't receive the love of Jesus without also imitating that love in Christian community. Verse 16 says, no servant is greater than his master. You think that you can go and be a lone wolf Christian, going out there in your life, doing it on your own outside of the fellowship of other believers? You think you're strong enough? You think you have that spiritual power that you don't need community? You think you're better than Jesus? Jesus had community. He didn't get the disciples just, as hangers-on. No, he needed that relationship. He was a human. Jesus truly was human. He was God and human. And as human, he needed relationship. He traveled and lived among and around and with his disciples for a reason. No Christian is greater than Jesus. We all need each other. But that doesn't mean that those of us who are gathered here today get up on our high horses and say, oh, we are good church members. See, we attend. No. Now, in practice, this story kind of gets corrupted in some of those ways. So we kind of flip it actually upside on its head. Here's what I mean. Have you ever, I don't know have we ever done, we've not since I've been here, but have you ever done a foot washing service, or have you ever been a part of a foot washing service? Anybody actually been a part of something like that? It's not something that happens super commonly, at least not in our churches. It's kind of a special thing if it ever happens. It's not a big deal if we've not been to one, but typically the way that gets done in the settings where it takes place, typically it's the pastor or maybe some other kind of senior minister who's the one who goes around washing everybody else's feet. And it is this grand expression of love and this genuine, intimate kind of experience. I've been a part of this kind of thing at least maybe a couple times. But the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet is so familiar to us in terms of being church people who hear and have read the Scriptures our whole lives. Sometimes it becomes so familiar that it gets hijacked. When that minister takes that time to get down and to wash people's feet, we think to ourselves, oh, how humble. Oh, isn't he just such a loving pastor? And we have all of this, and it's true, that's genuine feelings, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But when the status, the sort of the social status of the foot washer is raised, is elevated because of them washing feet, then some of the power of this experience is lost in that. Because that's not actually what the story is about. It's really, speaking as a pastor, it's really hard to be humble when everybody's whispering, "Oh, how humble, how holy." I know that y'all do that. I hear you. I'm so humble. So here's the thing. Number one, keep your socks on. Okay? That is not what we're doing today. Nobody's feet are getting washed, not by me today at least. You go, y'all have fun, but keep your socks on. What I would rather us do here as we come to the end of our service is to consider, think for yourself, what could be the modern equivalent of foot washing that you could do today? Obviously, we've talked about the foot washing that's not something in our time, in our culture, just in our place. It's not something we really do. That's not a familiar thing for us. But try and think about what would be the equivalent of that. What's something that you could do that would be a pure act of service and humility? I'll give you extra spirit points if you can do that anonymously, without anybody else being able to praise you, or without it being able to get back to anybody else that you were the one that did it. And by the way, if you do something with this sort of humble, pure service kind of, if you do that and then you say, "Oh, I did it all for Jesus," well, that doesn't count, okay? You can't take credit. You can't try and deflect that way. That's, in the young people, we call that a humble brag. "Oh, God is so good. I just did it all for Jesus." Don't brag with false humility. And here's the thing. The motivation is just as important as the service itself. The reason why you do it, the reason why you love and serve other people, is just as important as loving and serving them. So make sure that you're motivated out of love and out of care for the other person. Check your motives and make sure that it's not because you're doing it for recognition or because you're trying to check it off the list of, "That was something I was supposed to do." Or don't do it because you're afraid God's going to smite you if you don't do the right thing. That's not really what this is about. We need to cultivate in ourselves that genuine love and care for other people. It can be a hard transition to make if you're used to being faithful as a Christian and living your Christian life out of some other place. Can be a hard thing to transition to, and sometimes. And I know it's an intellectual, it's kind of a touchy, sort of a spiritual thing. It's hard to nail down in a concrete way, but really consider that. What can you do to serve someone else in that way? Or maybe you're here today and the reality is that you've not ever really come to church and participated in worship and fellowship or served others or done the Christian life things out of a genuine love and gratitude toward God and care for your brother and sister in faith. Maybe your whole life you have come to church and you've done the right thing because it was the right thing. Because that was what you were taught to do when you were little, and so you did it. But maybe you've not experienced that love of Jesus coming to wash your feet. And maybe for you it's always been trying to make sure I did it right instead. Trying to somehow earn the credit, to check the boxes, to be the good example for others out of a sense of duty, of obedience. If that's where you are today, then maybe we need to have a conversation about Jesus and about the gospel and make sure there is real clarity there about salvation. That it's not something that you earn, it's not something that you kind of rack up credits for, that the whole experience of Christian life is an experience of grace being poured in. And the whole experience of living Christian life is of gratitude and of a soulful love and care for others. Which is not to say that we don't ever do things that are hard, that we don't really want to do because they're what God has called us to do. That's not what I mean by that. But at the very center, at the core of that, should not be me trying to earn my way into God's good graces, but rather, that's not possible. Rather, we receive God's grace unmerited for no reason other than simply that God loved us. And then what we do is a response from that love. If you need to make sense of that and have real clarity on that in a way maybe that you haven't had before today, I would encourage you to come talk to me either as we end our service in a moment, as we sing the song of invitation, or sometime later. I would love to visit with you about what God is doing in your life. Let's pray together now as we close our service.